All right, well, today we start a brand new series that was supposed to start last week, but I was out with the flu, and so we kick it off today. But I'm very excited about this new series called Bystander. And for the next few weeks, we're going to journey with a man named John as he journeyed with Jesus. And John was one of Jesus' closest friends. He was one of his closest disciples, and he walked with Jesus for 3 years. He heard all of Jesus' teachings. He saw all that Jesus did. John walked with Jesus when it was popular, and he walked with Jesus whenever people, very powerful people, wanted him dead. And so he walked with Jesus in the good times and the bad times. And so years later, after Jesus is gone, John decides to write down these experiences that he had with Jesus. He wrote down and documented all of these things that Jesus said and that Jesus did, and he put all of this together into a book. And we call this book a gospel. And so in our Bibles, we can find and we can read this Gospel of John, the book of what Jesus said and did. And so as we head into this Easter season together as a church, we're going to read, hopefully, this Gospel of John together. We're going to walk alongside John as he walked alongside Jesus. And we're going to watch that Easter story unfold from a new perspective, from the perspective of an eyewitness and a bystander who was there with Jesus. And we even created this little tool that hopefully you've been able to grab one of these bookmarks here to help us all engage the story of John and Jesus. This bookmark has a reading plan printed on it that for the Gospel of John. They're on the back. And so every day you can put this bookmark in your Bible or on your bathroom mirror or maybe on your refrigerator, in your car, wherever, just as a reminder to read that day's passage. And the passages are not that long. It's just a few verses because it's going to take us 6 weeks to get through the Gospel of John, so it's not that much. So I encourage you to pick up this bookmark if you haven't gotten one. We have more at the Next Steps desk in the back. And I just encourage you to read along as we do this journey through John, the Gospel of John together. You can be reading, hopefully, through the week and watching these things happen, and then we'll talk about them on Sundays. And if you haven't gotten one of these yet, don't worry about being behind. It's just like 5 chapters or something. You can easily get caught up. And so I hope you'll be a part of that as we get into this Bystander series. But we're going to journey with John as he journeyed with Jesus. And in preparation for this series, I really benefited from a lot of the preparation and writings of pastor and author Andy Stanley. And so just want to give him some credit into a lot of the things that, some of the insights that we'll be bringing out over the next few weeks. But before we jump into the story, we got to address something kind of on the front end that I think dominates the Gospel of John, this theme that's running all the way through this Gospel account. And perhaps, and what this issue is, this theme, is this, that there might be probably the two most misunderstood and misused words in all of religion, and especially Christianity, are the two words faith and believe. Faith and believe. Now, just for a second, if we set religion and theology and all of those things aside for just a second, we all know what these words mean, right? We all know what believe and faith means. We know what these words mean in our homes or at work or in every other area of our lives or culture. But for some reason, these words, faith and believe, they get hijacked when they get dropped into religion or into Christianity. And things get really weird really quickly sometimes with these two words. Now here's what I mean. In our everyday worlds of work and family and home and our friends, business, we believe based on evidence. In other words, you and I make decisions about what you believe or what you don't believe based on evidence, what you see, what you hear, what you experience, what you read. And we also make decisions on what we believe based on our confidence in the person delivering the information. Right? These are just kind of normal, everyday things that we do without thinking when we try to figure out what we believe or don't believe. And this has never been more relevant to us than right now because we live in the age of fake news. Many of us have had to learn the hard way that you simply can't believe everything you read on Facebook, right? And if you didn't know that, public service announcement, you cannot believe everything you read on Facebook, right? We've all learned the hard way sometimes with that, or Instagram, or Twitter, or sadly, even a newscast. We can't always trust everything that we hear or see. And so how do we know what is worth believing and what is not worth believing? Well, we do two things. One is we look for evidence. We look for evidence, and then number two, we consider the source. We look for evidence, and we consider the source. When we're trying to figure out what is something worth believing or not, evidence is what we see, what we read, what we hear, what we experience. And we also believe based on our confidence in that person telling us the information. Now, from time to time, there's conflicting information, right? You ever had that happen to you, where even doctors maybe give you conflicting information or conflicting opinions, and you have to try to figure out, okay, which way am I going to believe? Some of us have heard that Donald Trump is the greatest president since Abraham Lincoln, while others of us have heard that Donald Trump is the next Hitler on the rise. Conflicting pieces of information. How do you know what to believe? We look for evidence and we consider the source. Who is telling you that Trump is so amazing or so terrible? And why are they saying it? What are their motivations in telling you that? And don't worry, this is not one of those times where I'm going to ask you, like, crowd participation and say, hey, everybody that loves Trump, raise your hand. No, we're not doing any of that, okay? I know when to keep myself out of trouble. We're all safe here, okay? But perhaps a safer example would be this extremely important question, at least it's extremely important to me, but close to many of our hearts, is this issue of, is coffee still good for us? This is so important, guys. Listen, I see Betsy come here early on Sundays, and man, she's distributing coffee to people, and it's just so awesome to see her serving people, and she's amazing. She brings me coffee, and I'm like, man, I just believe this is good for me. I mean, but is it good for us or not? Because it seems like ever so often research comes out that says coffee's bad for us, right? And then a couple of years later, another study's done, and it shows that coffee's good for us. So which is it? And how do we know what to believe? Well, of course it's good for us. And I believe that because I want to believe that. Right? I prefer to dismiss any information that tells me that coffee is bad for me. But I love holding out the studies that show coffee is good for me. Those are the ones I'm going to believe because they're the ones I want to believe. They have a word for this, and it's called confirmation bias. Right? Confirmation bias is when you and I only listen to the information which confirms what I already believe, and I dismiss the things that challenges what I believe. I want to find the things that confirm what I think. That's called confirmation bias, and we all struggle with that to some degree. But the point is this. All of us in our real-world experience and in our regular everyday lives, we all know what it means to believe something. And we all know what it means to have faith in something. And so what we're going to discover in this series together, hopefully, Bystander, is that when it comes to these words, faith and believe, they do not take on special meaning when they're dropped into the middle of Christianity. It's not just like special rules all of a sudden apply to these words. I don't know why we do this, but religious faith and religious belief are often divorced from reason. We divorce them from reason, and we confuse them with something called hope. And so, for whatever reason, these words, faith and belief, they take on a life of their own when put into Christianity, and they become more like hope, kind of like, well, I hope she's on time today. Well, was she on time last time? Well, no. Okay. Well, was she on time? Was she on time the time before that? Well, no. Has she ever been on time? Well, no. But I hope she's on time. That's hope, right? You hope, maybe you hope that that's going to happen, but it's good to have hope, but hope and belief, or hope and faith, they're two different things. They're different. And unfortunately, when it comes to our Christian faith, some of us grew up hearing things like, well, you just got to believe. You just got to believe. And if you're from the South, it went more like, well, you just got to believe, brother. You just got to believe, sister. Right? Maybe even someone's told you, like, you just need to have more faith. You need to have a bigger faith. But I'm not sure that that phrase really makes much sense when you think about it. Now, hang in with me for a minute. Does it really matter how big your faith is? I mean, you either believe something or you don't. Even when you're trying to figure out something you believe, you don't believe it yet. You're still trying to figure it out. So you either believe it or you don't. And when Jesus talked about faith, he actually said the opposite of this idea of having a big faith. He actually said, listen, you can move mountains with a faith the size of a tiny, tiny mustard seed. He said you didn't have to have much to do amazing things as long as it's real faith. As long as it's genuine, authentic faith. Pastor and author Timothy Keller has a great way of saying this, and he says it so brilliantly when he said it this way. He says, it's not the strength of your faith, size, how much you have, whatever. It's not the strength of your faith, but the object of your faith that actually saves you. Strong faith in a weak branch is fatally inferior to a weak faith in a strong branch. I can have a big faith in the wrong thing. And so as we journey with Jesus through this Gospel of John, we're going to discover an entirely different approach to faith than, well, you just got to believe, brother. Another brilliant Christian thinker and author put it this way. He says, the reason that so many people are easily talked out of Christianity is because they were never talked into it in the first place. The reason so many people are talked out of Christianity is because they were never talked into it in the first place. In other words, the reason students and college grads and business people, professors, whoever, any of us, the reason people are so easily talked out of Christianity is because they were never talked into it to begin with. They were just told, well, you just got to believe. And perhaps that was good enough for you when you were a child or when you were a teenager or when you were talking to your youth pastor, your Sunday school teacher, and that was fine for them. But then when you grew up and life hit you and someone may have talked you out of it because no one had ever really talked you into what you believed or what you were saying you believed. You read a book or you heard a lecture or you saw a debate online on YouTube. And someone talks you out of it. Because no one ever took the time to really explain what real faith is, or biblical faith. And so here's what John, Jesus' close friend and disciple, would tell you. I believe John would tell us, I did not follow Jesus out of a blind faith. I didn't just take it by faith, brother. And he would caution us against that as well. And I think he would tell us that there is more to faith than just that. John was given a title a little bit later in his life called an apostle, and basically that was just the highest leadership in the church, that early church. And so the apostle John, as he was beginning this relationship with Jesus, he left his father's fishing business to follow Jesus. And he did it because of what he saw, not because of some blind faith. In fact, by the time John wrote down his gospel, the Apostle Paul was dead. The Apostle Peter was dead by then. Probably all or most of his friends were dead. He lived to be really old, like 90 years old, they think. And of Jesus' first 12 disciples, John was the last one alive. He was the lone survivor to the very end. And apparently, probably, I'm just filling in some blanks here, but somebody may have convinced John to write down his story with Jesus because his is written the latest. After all of the other Gospels were written, John writes his. And you can see this because John is completely different than the other three Gospels. So different. And they're probably saying, John, listen, you're the last guy standing. You're the last disciple standing, and we still don't know your story. We don't know your take. We have Matthew's Gospel, and we've got Peter's story through Mark, and we've got Luke's investigation and his story. But you're one of the last eyewitnesses of Jesus alive. We need you, the church needs you to write down your story, your experiences with Jesus. And so the cool thing about the Gospel of John is that John was not content just to simply write down what happened. He wants to tell us why it happened and why he wants us to know it happened. John makes his purpose in writing his gospel really clear, crystal clear towards the end of it. He says this, he says, hey, listen, if you're wondering why I wrote this, if you're wondering what the point of all of this is, here it is. In John 20, he says, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. And he's talking about his gospel, just his. There's many other things that Jesus did that I'm not even writing about. But these, the ones I've chosen to tell you about, these are written. The reason I'm writing these down is so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. So Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples. In other words, these things didn't happen in a corner where nobody saw them or no one could talk about them or nobody witnessed them. He says, look, you've come to the end of my account in my gospel. And I've told you a lot of the things he said, but he said a lot more. I've explained a lot of the things he did, but he did a lot of other things. But the purpose for me writing what I've written is not simply that you will know what Jesus did or you'll know what Jesus said, but these are written so that you may believe. Not just know, but that you may believe it. I want you to believe. I want you to journey with me in my experience with Jesus. My hope is that you will experience through my experience Jesus in such a way that you'll be convinced that he is who he claimed to be. And so as we journey with John, he's going to tell us there were events, but they weren't just random events. He calls them signs. There were signs that pointed to something, and those signs were evidence. And because of that evidence, because of what he saw and heard and experienced, he decided and believed that Jesus was who he claimed to be. Because he was there, he saw it with his own eyes, and he experienced it. And when he began to believe that Jesus was who he claimed to be based on that evidence, and he placed his trust in him. And here's why this is so important. Because all throughout John's gospel, and also Matthew's and Mark's and Luke's, what we find is that Jesus' disciples, they're kind of an up and down bunch, aren't they? They're up and down. They believe and then they don't believe. They believe, they don't believe. They have faith, they don't have faith. And then they weren't so sure because they weren't easy to convince. Andy Stanley said it this way. He says, these guys didn't believe in superstition. They were trying to sort out who Jesus was and what he was saying to them. And in the end, it wasn't faith that moved them or convinced them. It was what they saw and what they heard. And so in the Gospel of John, he's not just giving us these random events that are disconnected or not connected. He organizes his entire gospel around what he calls signs. 7 signs that he organizes his whole book around. And it's interesting that he uses this word signs instead of the word miracle, because they're 2 different words. And he chooses the word signs. And this is so important because these supernatural miracles and acts of Jesus, the healings, the walking on the water, all of these things, they were not just random acts of kindness, right? He wasn't just showing off. These were signs that were pointing to something. They pointed to something, and specifically what they pointed to was who Jesus was, his identity, that he was the Son of God, God in the flesh. And now it's easy for us to get enamored with the miracles, right? Because they're so impressive. But John knew that's our temptation. He knew that's a mistake. And so throughout his gospel, he's like, hey, these miracles aren't for the sake of miracles. These miracles have a specific purpose, and their purpose is to point people to who Jesus is. So John does his best in his gospel to help us not become enamored with the supernatural, with the miracle, but to become enamored with the person who worked the miracles. That's what he wanted. So let's talk about sign number 1. And over the next few weeks, I hope that we can get through all 7 signs. Obviously, we're a week behind, so one of these weeks we're going to have to talk about 2 somehow. But we're going to talk about sign number 1 today. And the interesting thing is, this very first sign was so well known by the time that John wrote down his gospel. He wrote this years after Jesus had left, okay? And so by the time he wrote his gospel down, this first sign, this story was so well known that he doesn't even really tell us the miracle that happened. He kind of just brushes over that part. He glosses over that because he assumes that everybody reading his gospel already knows about it. I mean, it had just become so much of part of everyone's memory that they talked about it. It was just part of the culture at that point within the church. And so in John's Gospel, chapter 2, John recounts this experience with Jesus, his first sign. It says, on the 3rd day, a wedding took place in Cana in Galilee, way, way, way north of Jerusalem, and Jesus' mother was there. Now, that's my translation there of way, 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 way north. But John gives us all this detail because these aren't once upon a time fairy tales, right? These are real events. These things really happened and things actually occurred. And so he's giving us these details of where and when and how. And so you may have heard this, but wedding celebrations back then took up most of a week. You know, and some cultures still do this today, right? Where a wedding celebration takes days. And so that's an expensive thing, right? And that's why what happens next is such a catastrophe. And it'd be a catastrophe today. I mean, this is every wedding planner and bride's worst stress dream come true. When the wine was gone, they ran out. In the midst of this celebration, they run out of wine. Jesus' mother said to him, they have no more wine. So they run out of wine. And at a good Wesleyan wedding, this would be more like running out of dessert, right? It would be a travesty. But you understand what I'm saying. But running out of cake or punch or whatever there's supposed to be at your wedding that everybody expects, and suddenly you're out of it, there's no more of it. This is a very embarrassing moment for the bride and the groom and the family and everyone involved. And so Jesus' mother must have been part of this wedding committee, or maybe she was working for the catering service for this meal, because she turns to Jesus when this outage happens. And it's almost like she knew that in a crisis, she could call on her very resourceful son. It's like she knew he might be able to do something about this. Doesn't that make you just think about what it was like to grow up with Jesus? Some of the back and forth they must have had in their family. So Jesus' mother turns to Jesus. I mean, really, let's just think about that. I mean, do you go to the grocery store with Jesus, or do you just say, hey, son, we need some bread and milk. We need to stock up because Corona's coming. Could you just do that for us? I mean, what do you do in that home? That's just crazy. Well, anyway, she knew it was okay to turn to Jesus in a crisis. And Jesus replies like this. He says, woman. Now, do not try that at home. Okay? This is not a what would Jesus do moment. Okay? This is not. Do not do what Jesus says here. But please do not say to your wife, woman, and then just say, well, I'm just quoting Jesus. You can't do that. Okay? Don't do that. That's funny to us how it reads, right? I mean, because of the translation. But in the original language, this was really more just of a more formal, respectful way to address her. Maybe there were some other people in the room, and so, he couldn't just say, Mom, But then he asks this question, and he says, woman, why do you involve me? My hour has not yet come. In other words, Mom, I've come to save the world, not weddings. Okay, this was not really how I planned to go public. This was not going to be the place, right? Besides, the Wesleyans will really be mad at me if I make wine. I can't do this. I love having a lot of mileage with that one. But we all know how this goes, right? If mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. And so Jesus does what any smart son does. He listens to his mother. And his mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. I love that. It's like she just assumes, do whatever he says he's going to do, right? Now, have you ever wondered, how this miracle is just kind of different from a lot of the other ones, isn't it? I mean, why would John include this miracle, this sign? I mean, it's not healing or raising someone from the dead or anything dramatic like that or even helpful, right? I mean, this is helpful, but, no one's being healed from a disease or receiving their sight or, something like that. This is like a catering problem. And it seems like from the story that very few people, if you read the story, it seems like very few people at the wedding ever find out that this miracle even took place. We'll see that in a second. So what's the point? Why did he include this? Well, nearby stood 6 large stone water jars. And these were large water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing. And they each held about 20 to 30 gallons of water. And so then we know this was a family then, just from the details here, that this family, they were good Jewish men and women, and they kept the Jewish law because Jewish law demanded that the Jews do certain kinds of washing to stay ceremonial clean. That's why they had the jars. And so these are really large stone jars, and they're sitting there empty. And here's the significance of this. If you put yourself into the story, these jars dominate their life because of all the rules and the regulations and the washings they have to do every single day. And they are symbols of that old covenant, of the old sacrificial systems and the traditions that Jesus had come to replace. And so Jesus decides to go public by using these jars, something that would soon be replaced by his life and his work on this earth. God's temporary old covenant with the nation of Israel was disappearing. It was coming to an end, and these jars represented that entire sacrificial system and the old system of approaching God. And Jesus decides to use this moment, this illustration, probably that nobody ever caught in the moment. And maybe Jesus explained this to John later, or John puts 2 and 2 together later, and he's like, we've got to include this story in my gospel because it was so significant. God's temporary arrangement was disappearing because someone new was on the scene. And the story continues. It says, Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water. And so they filled them to the brim, it says. So there's all this foreshadowing. I mean, it's this perfect introduction to Jesus' ministry. Because he's saying, fill up these empty jars, fill them up with water as they were normally used to, and then something different is going to happen. We're not going to use these jars like we normally use them. They're going to do something they have never done before. The old is passing away, and behold, something new is happening. Someone new has come. And then he told them, now, draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet. Now, the master of the banquet was responsible for what was served and who served it and when it was served, all those details. And when the master of the banquet tasted that water, it says they did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. See, he didn't even tell us the miracle. John just kind of assumes we know about it. He did not realize, he being the master of the banquet, did not realize where it come from, though the servants who had drawn the water, they knew. So who saw the first sign? Who saw the first miracle? I love this. The slaves. While all the wealthy people had their fun and got drunk on their wine, it was the slaves that got to see God's glory. You see this all the time where Jesus shows favor to those without. And then he called the bridegroom aside. The master of the banquet called the bridegroom aside, and he says, everyone brings out the choice wine first and the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now. And this is amazing. He's like, you've done something very unusual here. I've never seen this done before. Normally people bring out the good stuff first, and then you bring out the cheap stuff when they're a little drunk and they don't care what it tastes like. So everybody starts with the fine wine. Oh, this is so good, but by the end of the week, they don't care anymore. And this is so powerful. But you have saved the best till now. And God had as well. Because that sacrificial system set the stage for the new that was coming. Just as that original wine set the table for the better wine that was to come later in that wedding feast. In the same way, God, through the nation of Israel and the Jewish people, established this covenant that would set up the world to expect one to come and fulfill that covenant in Jesus. And so Jesus uses this metaphor, this symbol. He creates an illustration right there at this wedding feast in Cana to say to the world, even though the world wouldn't understand it at the moment, something new has come. Something better has come. We've saved the best for last. There's nothing wrong with what came before. What came before was good, but it was temporary. It was there to set up what is happening now. And so what Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory of who he was. He wasn't just a teacher. He wasn't just a rabbi. He wasn't just a carpenter. It says his disciples believed in him. In other words, this was more than a miracle. This was a sign pointing. And it pointed to something and somebody. But nobody would fully understand it until later. And his disciples, don't miss this part, because his disciples believed. It says his disciples believed in him. But why did they believe in him? Because he got them together and said, come on, guys, just believe. Come on, you can do it. Just have faith, sister. Just have faith, brother. You just got to believe. No, he didn't say that. No, the reason they believed is because there was a reason to believe. There was a reason to believe. And so from the very outset, John in his gospel establishes this approach to faith. And we're going to find it all throughout the Gospel of John. Because never once is anybody asked to believe without there being any evidence or without there being any confidence in the person who's bringing that information. After this, the story goes on. It says he went down from Capernaum with his mother and brothers. By the way, Mary had many children after Jesus. Again, just a great little sidebar glimpse into this whole story. I don't think of Jesus as having a lot of brothers and sisters, but he did. And his disciples, and they stayed for a few days. But here's the thing. Unlike John, I hope this is kind of the question being begged this morning. Because unlike John, our faith in Jesus does not usually come by seeing. Right? Now, sometimes people come to faith in Jesus because of something they see. I mean, we hear stories of that, but it's rare. For most people, we don't come to faith by seeing like John saw, or like Peter saw, or like James saw, or like any of the disciples. We come to faith by hearing. But we're not asked to just believe. We're not asked to just, required to just take it by faith. We're invited. And this is what makes Christianity so different and so significant, that we're invited to believe what happened. We're invited to believe what happened based on the testimony of the people who were actually there. People like the fisherman turned disciple, John. And again, when John was writing all of this stuff down, he was probably the last apostle left. And in spite of all of that, it was because of what he saw, not because of what he believed. It was because of what he had heard, not simply because he had faith, that he arrives at this conclusion that has echoed over the last 2,000 years and has transformed our world, because he's the one that brought us these famous words as he wrote his gospel. And he says, because of what I've seen, because of what I've heard, because of what I've experienced, I'm convinced that God so loved this world that he gave his one and only Son, that whosoever would believe in him would not perish, but have eternal life. Now, John, how can you say such a thing? And he would say, because of what I saw, because of my experience with that rabbi from Nazareth. He was convinced. And whether you're convinced or not, this should make you think, at least. And that's why he wrote it. He was convinced, and he said, look, I'm just telling you what I saw, okay? I'm just telling you what I've concluded based on what I heard and saw and experienced. Now, don't ask me to explain it. But God made his dwelling with us, and we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Listen, I was just a simple fisherman. I was just a bystander. But I thought what happened was so important, I wanted to document my experience for you and for future generations. But not simply so that you would know what happened. No. No, it's way bigger than that. I wrote this thing with a specific purpose in mind. These things that I've chosen to document, these signs that I've written, that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. And that once you believe, that you, like me, might have life in his name. That's why I've done all of this. And so before this series is over, we're going to walk through these 7 signs that John talks about in his gospel. And it's going to be so much fun, so much story and conversation and back and forth. And my prayer is that before this series is over, as we move from sign to sign to sign, my hope is that you would believe and have life in his name as well. And that all of us, all of our faith, would be strengthened through this. But not because you took it by faith, not because you just took it from John. No, because you took it from John, an eyewitness to the life and ministry of Jesus. We've not been invited to believe in belief. We've not been invited to have faith in faith. We've been invited to place our faith and our trust in a real person. It's way better than just faith and belief on their own.